is one of our densest CPU benchmarks and reviews we've ever done, and Threadripper actually has some crazy efficiency. It was enough to get the whiteboard out. We'll talk about that later. Today we're digging deep into the 7970X and 7980X Threadripper parts for performance. And later today we're going to be live streaming an overclocking session with the 96-core CPU with Bill and Amit to set some world records with liquid nitrogen. We don't have a time yet, so you'll have to keep an eye out for notifications. You can hit the YouTube bell unironically to catch it. These are AMD's new 64-core and 32-core parts for the TRX 50 motherboards. And even if you're not in the market for them, the performance is fun to look at. And that's the biggest point of contention today. It's the price. Also that AMD kind of abandoned Threadripper last time, so they'll have to earn that trust back. It's been a while since AMD has launched an HEDT Threadripper part without the Pro name attached to it. Buyers might also be hesitant to buy into TRX 50 or WRX 90 after the last round. The 3970X launched at $2,000 and is being replaced by the 7970X at $2,500. The 7980X comes in where the 3990X was previously, except it's $5,000. From a technology standpoint though, the efficiency is the most interesting story today. Power consumption, thermals, and efficiency actually, and we're focusing our testing on HEDT Threadripper parts. Let's get started. We brought you this video with a sale for 10% off all tools on store.gamersnexus.net. This insane amount of testing and editing time is made possible by our audience. For a limited time, you can get 10% off of our project and soldering mats, which are heavy-duty, thick silicone mats for repairs or projects, even things like model building. You can also get that deal on our large anti-static mod mats for your next PC build. Perfect for a giant Threadripper machine. Or you could buy one of our medium mod mats with enamel pin or a 10-piece GPU teardown toolkit. Grab a good work surface or tool for yourself and support our testing at the same time at store.gamersnexus.net. There's a massive amount of testing in this video today, so we're going to keep it really focused in the intro and outro here. They're going to be slim. That's because we want to leave the airtime available for everything else. So for the testing, we've introduced a number of new workstation tests. These include Spec Workstation as a test suite, but also an extra focus on some of the existing tests that we have for workstations. Intel has competing parts, kind of. So Intel hasn't really made an HEDT part as in a non-pro sort of enthusiast grade X-class CPU in a long time. The 10980XE was maybe the most famous recent example, but that line has basically been dead. The Xeons, we don't have any testing for in this video today. Those would be possible competitors to the Pro line of Threadripper, which we are not reviewing here. We're looking at the HEDT 64-core and 32-core parts today, but we might add Xeon in the future if we do one of the Threadripper Pro parts. The test platform we use for Threadripper deviates a little bit from our standard test solution because it's just so different. We'll put that on the screen now. This will also be in our article on gamersnexus.net, which will go live in a couple days. Specs for the new Threadripper HEDT and Pro CPUs are on the screen as well. If you want those in detail, you can check the announcement post, but as you skim these specs, one important note. These are not meant to be gaming CPUs. Gaming is a really small focus for this review, and I'm going to call you all out. Last time we reviewed a Threadripper CPU, it was the 3960X, and I went back and looked at the most watched parts of the video, and everybody jumped to the gaming. That's not what these CPUs are meant for. We're testing gaming to make sure they can play the games and that it's not awful as an experience, that you don't have to go play games within BIOS and toggle things just to make it work. But please do not buy these CPUs for a gaming PC. It is a terrible waste of money if that's all you're going to do with it, and it'll be worse than if you bought something like a 7800X 3D or a 14900K. We just want to make sure everyone's putting their money in the best place for their needs. Like, for example, buying an entire computer for gaming for the cost of one Threadripper CPU. We'll start with the most interesting part, which is power consumption and efficiency. Despite being, in an absolute sense, a relatively high power consumption, these Threadripper CPUs are actually some of the most efficient CPUs we've ever tested. And in fact, the 7980X with its 64 cores is the most efficient CPU we've ever run through our test suite. So it's a really interesting part of the discussion, and one that we want to explore in depth today that we're going to be working through here. For this testing, we're measuring at the EPS 12-volt cables before VRM efficiency losses, so we're getting pure hardware readings for the power consumption. Here's the chart for an all-core Blender workload where every single thread is pushed to 100% on these CPUs. The 7980X pulled about 352 watts all-core, with the 7970X at 360 watts. That makes sense, actually. We found our 7980X to be a slightly better bin with lower voltage requirements when using Auto V-Core, contributing to this small gap. The 7950X pulled 250 watts in the same test. So with 25% of the cores of the 7980X, it pulled 71% of the power. That's definitely an efficiency advantage if you're actually leveraging those cores. The prior HEDT non-Pro 3970X measured at 232 watts in the same test, with Intel's old 10980XE at 191 watts. So for efficiency, what we're doing is we're looking at a fixed unit of work. So for a given frame to be rendered from an animation on the CPU, what is the power required throughout that process? And then we get an energy consumption number at the end of it. The efficiency is actually completely insane. The 7980X is the most efficient CPU we've ever tested. The 7950X with Eco mode, which isn't shown here, could kind of compete with these numbers, but that was Eco mode. While the power consumption here would make for an excellent headline, the actual efficiency means a lot more to us. It means that you'd use less energy in total to complete the same amount of work, even as compared against CPUs that consume technically less power, and that includes the prior efficiency king, the 5950X. So despite the 350 watt figure, the 7980X is more efficient than the 300 watt CPUs, by a lot. The 14900K has a 34.9 watt hour result, whereas the 7980X sits at 12.9. The 7970X isn't as efficient, but still did pretty well with a 21.6 watt hour result. Remember that this will change based on the type of work as well, of course, and the utilization of those cores. The 3970X of yore was also pretty efficient for its time, actually, at 20.1 watt hours. We didn't make these charts back then, so it's helpful to see it in this way. But the 7980X genuinely impresses us for its power efficiency here. Here's why it's so efficient. The 7980X specifically is at the best point in AMD's volt frequency curve. So it looks something like this. And because of this, you know, these CPUs with a 350 watt TDP, that has AMD's Threadripper parts as actually lower TDP than the server parts before them. So they have some room to play with here. If we look at vCore and the frequency for an all-core workload, in our testing, the 7980X was actually shockingly low. It tended to be about 0.84 to 0.845 volts for vCore. So that puts us, let's just call it 0.845. For frequency, it was in the range of 3900 to 4000 megahertz. So this means that AMD actually has a lot more room to boost if you wanted to throw away some efficiency. You could do some overclocking or use PBO to make that trade-off. The 7980X in our testing we found had a shockingly low, approximately 3.5 watts per core. For the SPI3 TFN total core power through software, not through clamp, we found this to be around 223 or so watts. For the SoC, it was approximately 72, again, through software monitoring, and some room in here for software error. Here's a table to make it easier than my handwriting. The 64-core CPU is operating at a lower frequency and, as a result, a much lower voltage. Also, the silicon quality is probably among the best on these higher core count CPUs. The voltage, though, dropped from a range of 1.09 to 1.1 volts on the 7970X to this 0.85-ish result for the 7980X. With software sensor logging, we saw the 7970X's cores were running anywhere from 8 watts to almost 9 watts per core, over double the 7980X's per core power consumption. That puts its SPI3 TFN core power around 270 watts, with SoC at about 70 to 71 watts. Let's talk briefly about thermals. So in past years, when we tested the original Threadripper and following ones, we found that full coverage versus a smaller contact patch actually did have a big impact on performance. So we compared two relatively like-for-like Noctua air coolers back then. For purposes of thermal testing here, we're going to be looking at what is possible with the cooler that AMD sent out with its review kits, which is an Asetek solution. So it's got a smaller contact patch, as you can see here, and then they have an adapter plate, which these have been around since the early Threadripper days. So we use that as well. That gives us, and we have a shot of it, basically circular spread of thermal paste right in the middle. Now, we'll do separate testing and a follow-up for how much it really impacts things, but for the discussion of thermals today, it wasn't throttling, and that's all that really matters for the benchmarks we're running here. It wasn't limiting the performance in any way. Here's the chart. In an all-core workload during a 30-minute Blender render collected at steady state, we found the 7980X's 8 CCDs to run between 57.7 and 64 degrees Celsius at 21C ambient. That's good overall. We were able to keep the CPU in check with a 360mm CLC at max speeds, and water blocks with full coverage would do great for Threadripper. The 7970X ran significantly warmer. It's still fine, but it is definitely higher, at 80 degrees maximum across the CCDs, and 74.5 for the minimum when averaged at steady state. Even though the CPU is technically lower end than the 64-core variant, it's running hotter across the CCDs. Let's take a look at the HEDT layout. The 7980X uses all 8 of these CCDs, starting at CCD 0 and counting up to CCD 7. The 7970X populates CCD 0, CCD 1, 2, and 3, according to AMD. The reason we're seeing this thermal behavior is due to the density. Both of these CPUs measured 350 to 360 watts in our power testing. That means that ISO power, the 7970X has all of its heat generated on the 4 innermost CCDs in this diagram, whereas the 7980X benefits from more surface area and lower heat and power density. At the same power consumption, the 7980X is spreading that power out over more cores and more physical area. This goes back to the per-core power consumption we talked about earlier. And that's why the 7970X ran hotter than the 7980X in benchmarking for thermals. Now it's time to look at the production benchmarks. Blender serves as our first production test. We use Blender for tile-based rendering, so one tile is generated for each thread. Here's the chart. The 7980X immediately impressed us with a 2.2 minute time to render a single frame of the GN intro animation logo that you watched for this video. But we render it at a much higher quality and sample size for benchmarking. The scaling here is clean. The 7980X's 2.2 minute result had at about 1/3 of the render time of the 16-core 7950X. That's not perfectly linear, but pretty close to it given the other differences. The 7970X required 3.6 minutes, making the 7980X 39% faster for about 100% more money. You're never getting value for these top-of-the-line parts, though. Compared to the 3970X's 5.2 minutes, as its HEDT non-pro predecessor, the 7970X required 31% less time to complete the render. The 3970X was originally $2,000, so the increase is 25% more money for 31% less render time. The 14900K, for reference, required 7.3 minutes, giving the 7950X a 12% lead. The less relevant comparison by price, but the pertinent one for today, gives the 7970X a 51% time requirement advantage, and the 7980X a 70% advantage. As a final note, we decided to just toggle the ECC modes. We saw no difference for this test between the modes. We've also historically noticed that this test isn't very memory dependent. Our next test is for code compile. For this one, we're compiling Chromium on Windows. A ton of you asked for us to bring this test back because we'd run it for years, but recently we stopped running it. We decided to bring it back in because so many people wanted to see it, and for Threadripper, it makes a lot of sense. The 7980X completed this compile in the fastest time we've ever seen for our test suite, maybe expectedly. This is a highly threaded workload that can leverage the cores. The build time was 31.5 minutes here, so it completed the compile in 27% less time than the 7970X's 43-minute result. There's definitely scaling, but for the ultra high end, the value doesn't linearly scale. Again, it's not abnormal for a flagship part, but it is something we really want to make sure everyone's aware of. The 7950X and X3D had times of 71 to 72 minutes, and were roughly tied with the 14900K at about 71 minutes. That means the 7970X's doubling of core count over the 7950X has it cut the time by about 40%. It's close to linear. As for the 3970X, that one required 60 minutes, a clean hour, which has the 7970X about 28% improved. Finally, ECC didn't seem to have an effect on the results for the 7980X when we toggled it on and off. File decompression is next, using 7-zip as the test platform. This test is measured in millions of instructions per second. The 7980X posted insane numbers here, clearing 500,000 MIPS. The 504K result has it only about 1% ahead of the 7970X, so there's no meaningful difference in this particular benchmark. We're hitting limitations of scaling on the 7980X, which will look different actually with compression. That said, the 3970X illustrates that there is clear scaling with the 7970X as a comparison. At about 499,000 MIPS, the the 7970X leads the 373K MIPS result of the 3970X by 34%. The 7950X's 276K result allowed the 7970X to lead by about 81%, once again jumping from the desktop 16-core to the HEDT 32-core posts a result that's nearly linear. That's pretty close to doubling considering the other differences within the chips. It's possible that faster memory would benefit here. It's also possible that we're just becoming bound elsewhere. There's more scaling between these new parts in compression testing. In this one, the 7980X performed 393,000 MIPS during compression, or about 390K without ECC. That's with an error, it's less than 1% difference, so they're about the same again. The lead over the 7970X is 12% here. It's a larger gap than decompression, but still a lot less than we saw in Blender and Chromium. The 7950X performed 193,000 MIPS, with X3D not really changing that much. The 7970X is about 82% ahead of it here, with the 7980X with ECC at about 104% ahead. As for the 3970X, it and the 3960X are within 1.5% of each other. We went back and checked the results for the previous years that we ran this test and saw that it was the same there. It looks like these two are encountering external limitations, and so they perform about the same. Scaling of the 7970X against these parts is clean, with a 125% boost over the 3970X. The 14900K did well in this benchmark, running nearly at parity with the 7950X. Our main takeaway here is that the modern high-end mainstream parts, like the 14900K and 7950X, are extremely competitive for their price as compared to even higher-end HEDT parts. But when you need the performance, the price might matter less to you, and the parts get harder to make. Adobe Photoshop using the Puget suite is next. In this one, we get the reality check that more cores doesn't always equal more better. Photoshop still likes frequency. CPUs like the 7950X and 14700K lead this chart. We need to rerun the 149 for this one though. X3D also doesn't benefit this particular test. The 7970X scored 1449 points in aggregate, allowing the 7950X a lead of 11% over the 32-core part while costing a lot less money. Even the 7600X did better than the 7970X here. The 7980X was worse still, with the 1300-point result landing just barely above a 12600K and a 5900X. But looking down the chart, we see similar positioning with the 3960X and 3970X. You shouldn't be buying these parts if your primary use case is Photoshop. This shows some of the components that make up the extended aggregate score. The GPU score here gives us an insight into more GPU-centric tasks within the Puget Photoshop test suite. It shows us how much the CPU might be binding the GPU's capabilities. The best performers have a GPU score of around 141 to 142 points. This chart reveals one of two significantly weak aspects for the Threadripper CPUs for Photoshop specifically. It's limiting the GPU-oriented Photoshop tasks. Looking at the general score, it does much better. The 7980X climbs from below the 5600X in filter performance. That's still not worth buying for this kind of work, but at least now we have a picture of where it was being held back. This is our Adobe Premiere chart. The 7980X is not on this chart because unfortunately it could not complete the test with the Puget suite. It does launch Premiere and it's capable of opening files. It just repeatedly crashed during this test. We're not sure if that's because of Puget Suite's execution or because of the CPU itself. It could be the test rather than more of a native compatibility issue. Here though, the 7970X brute forces its way to the top. At 918 points, it leads the 7950X by 8%. That's not worth the price in nearly any instance, but it does scale. From a value perspective though, that means the 7950X achieves 93% of the performance for 22% of the price, with the 14900K at 92% of the performance of the 7970X for 23% of the price. The old 3970X ran at 764 points, giving the 7970X an uplift of 18%. We'd be more interested in that if it were a drop-in upgrade, but AMD's abandonment of the previous Threadripper platform has cost it on the value proposition for smaller boosts like this. This could be justifiable if you could just put it in the same board, but you can't. So it's only valuable if you're buying this for some other work that better leverages it. We wanted to break out a couple scores from the video editing testing to understand what was boosting the 7970X the most. That's partly because we're considering building a new system with it because we could use all the video production performance we can get, obviously. This shows the Intraframe scoring. The 7970X has a strong and obvious lead here. It's at 132 points, which allows it to gap the 7950X by 11% and the 14900K by 15%. Now, in the sense of breaking out from the average previous top of the chart, it is a big jump. In the sense of value, it's not, and you shouldn't buy this for only this work unless you are really severely performance limited and video production is part of how you make money. Threadripper also did well in raw score, where the results previously got stuck clustered around the 14900K, 7950X, and 14700K from 49 to 51 points. The 7970X's 57.7 point result has it leading the 14900K by 13% in working with raw footage. The lead is similar against the 7950X here. It's not a huge jump, again, for doubling the cores and the price. Actually, it's more than double. Let's go with over quadrupling the price over the 7950X. But for anyone who desperately needs the performance, especially for professional paid work, at least it gives an option. It's just hard to justify that with the price jump, and that's not even counting the motherboard. Next, we want to look at the GPU effects score in video editing. Although these are GPU effects, the CPU can govern the performance ceiling. In this test, the 14900K and 7950X were within error of each other and set the ceiling for the chart. The 13900K and 13700K are also within error of each other, and most of these results are so tightly packed that the differences between immediately adjacent results are often just one more pass away from swapping places. The 7970X, though, dropped a few points. At 97.4 for its score, we see that GPU effects-related performance remains a weaker aspect. It's still achieving most of the maximum, but it won't outperform the 14900K or 7950X in this specific type of test. Now we're going to get into Spec Workstation tests. So Spec provides a number of test suites that are prepackaged, and they'll run things like computational fluid dynamics, simulation software for molecular movement, and it also looks at biomedical and energy or oil, all types of things, financial. So we're running a suite that analyzes those different aspects that a Threadripper CPU might be good at. And for this, we use the default threads per process setting for all applicable tests. And otherwise, there are a couple of these where we're not too familiar with the software itself. Some of them even have words we don't know because we're getting into biomedical. But the numbers are there. So if that means something to you, you'll be able to look at the charts and extrapolate the meaning that hopefully helps guide you to the right CPU. This set of tests shows the performance in various mathematical and computational fluid dynamics tools. CalculiX is an open source tool that solves differential equations using finite element analysis. WPC CFD is based on the OpenFOAM open source fluid dynamics solver, and Rodinia CFD is described by Spec Workstation as, quote, an unstructured grid finite volume solver for 3D Euler equations representing compressible flow. We know what numbers mean, so here's the chart. The 7980X and 7970X were within 3% in the OpenFOAM type performance. With the 7980X, there's a large lead in Rodinia CFD at 62% ahead. The 14900K outperformed the 7970X in this category as well. And in CalculiX, the 7980X pushed a large lead of 126% in aggregate over the 14900K and 115% over the 7950X. We didn't run the 7970X on this one because the embargo is really close now. Spec's life sciences application benchmarks include Sandia National Labs LAMMPS for molecular property simulation, NAMD for molecular dynamic simulation, and Rodinia parts for medical imaging to track a heart, particle potential, thermal simulation, and speckle reduction. Here, the 7980X is noteworthy in all categories. The 7970X is likewise a high performer. And interestingly, last-gen Threadripper had a breakout in the NAMD calculations, while the 7950X beats the 14900K in 2 of 3 tests. The 7980X leads the 7970X by about 30% in LAMMPS, and a larger 57% in what I'm going to start calling NAMD. Spec.org provides a financial services benchmark running Monte Carlo probability simulations for risk assessment, Black-Scholes pricing models, and binomial options pricing models. Frankly, this is an area that we are not familiar with at all, so we're just going to give you the numbers. The 7980X is massively ahead here. We're not close to this space, but assuming this extrapolates to real-world use cases, it'd have a lead of 60% over the 7970X and 183% over the 7950X. Let us know if you're part of this world and what it means to you. Next is Spec's energy benchmark. In this one, the 7980X posts massive scaling in the convolution test, which processes a random 100 by 100 pixel filter on a 20K by 20K pixel image. It also has a strong lead in FFTW and SRMP tests here. Now for the gaming charts. Quick reminder, this is mostly to make sure games work and that you don't have to do weird things to make them run. There's a higher run-to-run variance than typical with the high core count Threadripper parts here. This affects results averaging, but not in a meaningful way for the gameplay experience. Ultimately, all we're looking for is that they can still run games reasonably. You should not expect them to do extremely well. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 7970X ran at 90 FPS average, with lows actually completely fine. They're right in line with the neighbors, so that's good. The 90 FPS average result has it below the 12900K and tied with the 7700X. That's not bad, considering historically, Threadripper has struggled in gaming scenarios. It's far away from the best on the chart, where the 7950X 3D has a 39% lead, but it's not exhibiting bad frame pacing, and it's more than playable. You'd still at least be able to play Baldur's Gate 3 on your Threadripper workstation. That'll make Wendell from Level 1 Techs happy. The 7980X ran at 92.2 FPS average, so even the 64-core solution did fine. At 1440p, the scaling is about the same. This test is only here to show that increasing the GPU load doesn't always immediately limit the CPU scaling. But there are limitations to how well Threadripper can do. Our next test will look at Stellaris for CPU simulation time. This test measures in time rather than frame rate, so it's a tangible change when we see swings of 10% or more. In this chart, the best results are all stuck around 30 seconds. The 7980X required 42 seconds for simulation, with the 7970X taking 41 seconds. The gap between these and the 7950X is about 21%, with the 14900K and the 7800X 3D leading Threadripper 7000 by upwards of 30%. It's not bad performance, just like last time, but it is noticeable. The older Threadripper parts are down around 57 to 60 seconds, which is significantly slower than modern hardware, especially with frequent play of Stellaris. In Final Fantasy XIV, the 7970X ran at 172 FPS average, with lows spaced about the same as the flanking CPUs. The 7980X was a little bit behind this, at 159 to 162 FPS average. Intel has long held the top portion of this chart. There's a stark line you could draw between the best AMD and the best Intel CPUs here. But on the AMD side, the 7950X leads the 7970X by 9% with its 188 FPS average result. The 14900K leads the 7970X by 57%, but if you're buying for workstation use first and foremost, this at least does well enough in gaming to get by. We didn't have to disable cores to play, we didn't have to play any weird tricks or enable special features. That's the most important part. It needs to be easy to switch workloads. 1440p was the same. The benchmark is completely scalable at the CPU level, so no meaningful change here outside of run-to-run variance. In Cyberpunk 2077 with the Phantom Liberty expansion, the 7970X and 7980X were about tied at 134 to 136 FPS average. The ceiling is 203 FPS average here, set by the 7800X 3D and its X3D compatriots. The 7800X 3D is about 50% ahead of the 7970X, with the 14900K about 25% ahead. Frame time pacing, again, is no problem on the new Threadripper CPUs. In F1 2023, the maximum result in our list is the 7800X 3D at a staggering 511 FPS average. The other X3D parts are alongside it, so this game clearly benefits from cache, which makes it interesting because Threadripper CPUs have that in abundance. But they have other limitations that prevent this from mattering in F1 23. The 7980X does okay. It lands alongside the 7600X and just ahead of the 14600K, but it can't make up for the frequency advantage on CPUs like a 14900K and up. And the 7970X was behind the 7980X by about 25 to 30 FPS, landing it closer to the 14600K and 13600K. So that's interesting just because they diverged a little more here than in the other games. Frame time pacing was fine. The game is playable, which is the bar we're setting. Our next chart to look at clock speeds in all-core workloads. We're reporting the average of all cores and the maximum single core at any given interval. This was when testing Blender in an all-core and constant load. The 7980X plots first. For this one, we measured an average frequency starting at about 4500 MHz, but immediately dropping down with load. The CPU bounced between 3.7 GHz to 4.35 GHz throughout the test for the most part. The spiky line you're seeing is expected, and plotting the maximum helps give perspective on that. There's always at least one core boosting to around 4791 MHz, which is typically when the core is at the start or the end of processing its tile. As for whether these numbers make sense, AMD's advertised maximum boost is not during an all-core 100% load, so you would see that number just before this test started. Here's the 7970X plot. In this test, the all-core frequency average was 4600 to 4700 MHz. Any single core's peak was again 4791. As with the 7980X, there are spikes above 5 GHz prior to the start of the test, but the all-core workload predictably drops the maximum speed, which is expected. Wrapping all this up quickly, to name a couple of the issues we ran into with testing, Rainbow Six Siege didn't launch at all, so that you still encounter that sometimes with games. We encountered issues also with higher variance than typically in gaming, so it wasn't experience ruining in the games we tested, but we did notice higher sort of run-to-run deviation. Additionally, Premiere failed to render on the 7980X with version 23.6 via the Puget suite. It does open, and it's possible it works in a different version of it or outside of the suite, but ours was not able to complete a render. That aside, the main takeaways are these. The thermals are lower in our tests on the 64-core than the 32-core CPU, which is interesting, and that's due to the arrangement of CCDs and better distribution of heat. The 7980X is also crazy energy efficient due to the low spot on the VF curve that AMD chose for it, which means there's a lot of room for PBO, or overclocking. The value is blown way out. As you would expect, these are diminishing return CPUs. These are the what else are you gonna buy an equally expensive or maybe more expensive competitor. So this is not something you buy for value. It's one of those things where if you actually need the performance, hopefully you already know. And what matters is that maybe you're making money with your computer, having an extra bump, even if it costs astronomical amounts more money, will pay for itself eventually if you're working with the machine. In either case, the value is way, way better at a $500 mainstream part from Intel or AMD. It's just that those don't do what these do. The 64-core at its price is effectively unattainable unless it really is a professional endeavor, and even then, it's expensive. Also, the 64-core doesn't always scale well. It depends on the application, so it's important that you do research on the workload you're running and make sure it will scale. That part's really the most important. Make sure you look at posts online, reviews, whatever. Try and find out if it'll scale like you hope it will with your application before you spend this kind of money. And that's it for now. This review is completely packed. We'd prefer to leave you with all the numbers for this one, and just hopefully that helps you make a decision based on what you're buying, or if you're watching this for entertainment, now you get to see some crazy numbers from a CPU. We wanted to maximize the airtime for the benchmark. So check back for the live stream later today if you're watching when this goes up, because we're going to be working on the 96-core and setting some world records. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more and go to store.gamersaccess.net to support us directly and get 10% off of our tools, and we'll see you all next time.